Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take the fire hose of history, turn it down to a manageable stream, and deliver the insights you need to be truly well-informed.
Today, we are undertaking a truly massive mission. We are cracking open the sources on a civilization that endured for over a millennium, a golden bridge between the ancient world and the modern. And yet somehow, for centuries, it's just been relegated to historical footnotes.
We are talking about the Byzantine Empire, the inheritor of Rome, centered in Constantinople. And here is the paradox, the central mystery we have to confront immediately. The Western world owes this forgotten empire an incalculable debt.
Absolutely. I mean, the list of contributions is it's profound. You look at modern European legal systems, and their DNA is directly traceable to the codification of Roman law.
Under Emperor Justinian.
Exactly, achieved under Justinian. And then you look at our cultural foundations, and you realize that Byzantium preserved the majority of the Greek and Latin classics, Plato, Aristotle, Homer, texts, that the West was either unable or, frankly, unwilling to safeguard during its dark ages.
And that's not even mentioning the sheer architectural and artistic genius. I mean, the breathtaking splendor of the Hagia Sophia or the stunning rich mosaics you find in places like Ravenna.
Right.
Yet, as our sources point out, most history curricula they rush from the fall of Rome straight to the medieval kingdoms. They just leap over 1,000 years of continuous, sophisticated civilization.
It's what one historian called a little-deserved obscurity. And the reason is, well, it's kind of tragic. History is often written by the victors, or in this case, by those who simply survived the best. When the Roman Empire fractured, first politically, then theologically, a deep cultural and eventually religious contempt set in between East and West. That contempt hardened into resentment, especially after the Crusades, leading the West to effectively, turn its back.
There's that famous observation from Edward Gibbon, the great historian of Rome, that's often quoted here. He mused that without the vigilance of Constantinople, Europe might have succumbed to invasion, and the call to prayer might have echoed over Oxford's dreaming spires.
That's how high the stakes were. This wasn't just some localized empire. It was the shield of civilization.
So our mission today is to pull this hidden history back into the light. We are going to dive into the source material to understand the fundamental mechanics of this empire, how it was founded, how it survived when the West collapsed,
Why it fractured from its Western counterpart, and maybe most importantly, why its ultimate legacy defines the world you live in today.
And to start this journey, we have to go back to the source of the chaos and the radical solutions proposed by the emperor who paved the way for the new Rome, Diocletian.
Right, we're starting not with Constantine, but with the dramatic reforms of his predecessor.
Okay, let's unpack this moment. To truly appreciate why Byzantium became a necessary 1,000-year enterprise, you have to feel the sheer existential panic of the era that preceded it, the crisis of the 3rd century. What did that actually look like on the ground?
It was basically 80 years of continuous systemic failure. The imperial throne had become a death trap.
A death trap.
Literally. If you look at the first 80 years of the 3rd century, 29 men wore the imperial purple, and only one of those men died a natural death.
Wow, only one.
Just one. The army, which was supposed to be the guarantor of stability, became the prime driver of instability. It was constantly raising and deposing new candidates. It was chaos.
And the irony is that what had previously been the Roman Empire's greatest asset suddenly became this massive liability.
Precisely. The sources detail this magnificent infrastructure. More than 50,000 miles of graded, arrow-straight roads, the vast network of aqueducts, the integrated financial system. For centuries, this network successfully exported Roman stability and law.
But in the 3rd century?
In the 3rd century, these same highways became pathways for chaos. They allowed rebel armies, ambitious generals, and increasingly bold barbarian hordes to rush straight into the heart of the empire with just alarming speed.
So the empire was too vast to govern, constantly under attack on multiple frontiers at the same time, and the center of power was utterly unstable. So how did this soldier from Dalmatia, Diocletian, respond to a problem that just seemed fundamentally unsolvable?
He was a brilliant pragmatist. He seized power in the traditional way, through the assassination of his predecessor, but he quickly recognized the problem was structural, not personal. He acknowledged, quite openly, that the empire stretching from Britain to Egypt, from Gibraltar to Persia, was just too large for one man to govern. Even spending his whole life in the saddle, he couldn't react fast enough to crises thousands of miles apart.
And his solution, the tetrarchy, was just completely...
Utterly radical. Yeah. It was an unorthodox, pragmatic split. He effectively divided the administrative world in half, making himself the senior emperor or Augustus in the east,
Oh, right.
and elevating a man the sources refer to as his old drinking buddy, Maximian, to co-Augustus in the west. He then appointed 2 junior emperors, or Caesars, under them.
So it was a 4-part rule. The idea was to ensure a rapid local response to threats.
Exactly. But dividing the map was one thing. That didn't solve the core problem you mentioned, that the army was loyal to a personality, not to the position. How did he prevent these new thrones from being immediately assassinated, just continuing the cycle?
Right. How do you break the cycle?
This is where we see the definitive ideological shift that will define Byzantium for 1,000 years. Diocletian understood that the Roman people, and especially the legions, were still operating under this worn veneer of the dead republic.
The pretense of serving the will of the people, the whole STQR thing.
Right, Senatus Populus Romanus, the Senate and the Roman people. He understood he had to abandon the idea of the emperor as merely the princeps, the first citizen who theoretically served the will of the people.
So he just got rid of it.
Exactly. He cast that pretense off entirely. He needed to stabilize the precarious throne, so he adopted these Eastern autocratic methods, essentially creating a semi-divine emperor. The throne was propped up with the might of Olympus.
He claimed divinity.
He did. And this made revolt an act of impiety and assassination, an act of sacrilege. Visitors had to prostrate themselves, an act called adoratio, in his presence. This shift to the Dominus et Deus Lord and God was his final, desperate solution to achieve political stability.
That is a staggering pivot point. It shifts the entire political framework from a kind of quasi-republican model to an absolute autocracy, which, as you point out, becomes the defining political ideology of the Byzantine throne for centuries.
It created an expectation of divine centralized authority. However, this divine claim immediately brought him into collision with the fastest growing and most resilient movement in the empire, Christianity.
Which makes sense. We know the period was characterized by immense misery, corruption, and crushing heavy taxation. The common people were taking refuge in the solace and community of Christianity, which was the most popular of the mystery cults spreading across the empire.
And the thing is, the Christians were not rebels in any traditional sense. They readily paid their taxes, they served in the army, and they obeyed the laws. But when imperial officials demanded that symbolic act of offering a sacrifice to the deified emperor, which was a confirmation of Diocletian's entire political strategy, they flatly refused. They declared the emperor was just a man.
And that refusal, no matter how small the act seems, it undermines the very foundation of Diocletian's new autocratic order.
It struck at the heart of his solution to the crisis. If the Christians wouldn't recognize the emperor's sacrosanct status, then the entire structure of stability could crumble. And that is why Diocletian initiated what turned out to be the final and most serious attempt to suppress the religion, issuing an edict demanding sacrifice on pain of death.
What's extraordinary, though, is how Diocletian eventually handled the issue of succession, which was the original core problem that he set out to solve.
I mean, even after everything, he remained committed to constitutional stability. By 305 AD, he was exhausted. He knew he was fighting a losing battle against the sheer size of the empire and the fervor of the Christians. And so he did the unprecedented. He retired.
He just stepped down. He didn't wait to be overthrown or assassinated.
He and Maximian both stepped down, allowing their respective Caesars, the junior emperors, to ascend to the rank of Augustus, thereby creating a clean constitutional transfer of power.
The Tetrarchy was his attempt at a predictable succession.
It was. And the best part, the sources give us this image of him happily settling down to plant cabbages at his massive palatial estate in Salone. He solved the chaos, restored stability through these radical political means, and then tried to secure that stability through a constitutional transfer. He provided the necessary, stable political foundation for everything that followed.
Unfortunately, Diocletian's dream of constitutional stability died in his cabbage patch. The moment he was gone, his system imploded almost instantly.
That's the nature of power built on personality, isn't it? Even if it's personality enforced by religious decree. When Diocletian's co-Augustus, Constantius the Pale, died in Britain, his soldiers completely ignored the Tetrarchy and immediately hailed his son, Constantine, as Augustus.
Which just undid Diocletian's meticulously planned succession.
And plunged the empire right back into civil war. It was a brutal struggle for supremacy, thinning the field until only Constantine remained triumphant in the West. And that's when we get the historical pivot point that's often taught in schools, the ambiguous conversion of Constantine.
Right.
He was a soldier, operating under the patronage of the sun god. Sol Invictus, the unconquered son whose standards he carried into battle. While he claimed a vision before the decisive battle against Maxentius in 312 AD, the reality of his conversion is, well, it's far more complex.
He saw Christianity, which had survived the Great Persecution, as a potent, unifying force for an empire that was just desperate for common ground.
Exactly. But the sources are clear that his acceptance of Christianity wasn't clean or immediate.
Not at all.
Far from it. He held on to the title of Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of the traditional Roman pagan religion, until his death. Furthermore, images of Sol Invictus and Mars Convervitor continued to appear on his imperial coins for years after his claimed conversion.
So whether it was genuine faith or brilliant political opportunism.
Right. He recognized the utility of the new faith in binding the wounds of the empire.
And as he was solidifying his power and religious policy, he carried out several reforms, driven by the immediate economic chaos of the civil wars, that had truly extraordinary and lasting consequences, especially for the West.
These were emergency measures. The constant confusion of civil war meant farms were abandoned and markets were disrupted as people fled. To ensure the tax base and food supply didn't collapse, Constantine issued decrees to stabilize the workforce. He forced peasant farmers to stay on their land, creating a hereditary obligation to the soil.
And he went further than just farming, didn't he?
Oh, yeah. He locked the members of specific critical guilds, bakers, shipwrights, hog merchants into their occupations, forcing their sons to follow the same path. This was pure economic triage. He needed a guarantee that the system would keep functioning, regardless of where the armies were fighting.
Now, this is the crucial distinction that changes the course of Western history. You have a single piece of imperial legislation, but its enforcement is completely dependent on geography.
Precisely. In the relatively stable, prosperous, and deeply urbanized East, this legislation was largely unnecessary and was rarely enforced. But in the West, which was perpetually collapsing into chaos and lacking strong centralized authority, local officials were desperate. They enforced this law ruthlessly.
So, an emergency wartime decree designed to ensure the grain supply in the 4th century became the unintended root system for the rigid social structure of the Middle Ages.
That's the deep dive takeaway. The heavy enforcement of this Civil War legislation, locking farmers to the land and creating inherited obligations, became the foundation of serfdom and the feudal system that characterized Western Europe for the next 1,000 years.
A completely accidental side effect of an economic emergency.
It completely redirected the social trajectory of half the world.
Incredible. 1,000 years of social structure rooted in an emergency decree. But Constantine wasn't done reshaping the world. He realized Rome itself, the Eternal City, was geographically obsolete.
It was a practical backwater. Diocletian had already recognized this, declaring the capital was wherever the emperor happened to be. The traditional location was too far from the troubled Danube and Persian frontiers, and it was burdened by centuries of pagan association and senatorial inertia.
He needed a fresh start.
A city built explicitly on a Christian axis, and his choice of Byzantium was strategic genius, far surpassing the symbolic value of the old capital.
What made the site so perfect?
The site itself, ancient but largely undeveloped, was perfect. It was situated on a peninsula, surrounded on 3 sides by water, offering incredible natural defenses that would later prove impenetrable. And crucially, it possessed a superb deep-water harbor, the Golden Horn, which controlled the lucrative trade choke point between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean.
If you control that strait, you control the wealth of the East.
You do. So he chose a site with 7 hills to mimic Rome, determined to build Nova Roma, a new Rome, a city unfettered by a pagan past.
How did he actually populate a brand new metropolis? That seems like a monumental task.
He marshaled the resources of the entire empire and built it almost overnight. To draw power eastward, he offered massive incentives. Senators were tempted with luxurious palaces and expanded powers in the new Senate House. He offered tremendous social mobility to anyone who moved. And, crucially, he offered public grants and enough free grain, a daily ration called the annona, to feed more than 200,000 inhabitants.
Wow.
This was a logistical feat designed to drain population and wealth from the Old West.
He gave them bread, and he made sure they had their circuses as well. The Hippodrome, the massive stadium for chariot racing, became the centerpiece of civic life.
It was colossal. The sources describe the lavish spectacles, the chariot races, the gymnasts, the painted actors, the wild animal fights. And to oversee these festivities and maintain civic order, he appointed official, organized spectator factions, the Blues and the Greens.
Which were more than just sports clubs.
Oh, much more. They developed immense wealth and political influence, which, as we'll soon see, set the stage for explosive future drama.
Right. Despite Constantine's best efforts, the empire he left behind was far from fully Christian. He had only legalized the new faith.
And the imperial administration, the Senate, the army leadership, they were still heavily pagan. Moralists warned that abandoning the traditional gods, who had guided Rome to greatness for 1,000 years, could only lead to disaster.
And they found their champion in Julian, a man known to history as the Apostate. He was Constantine's cousin, only spared from the massive family purges following Constantine's death because he was 5 years old and presented no threat.
He was a quiet, serious, and deeply introverted scholar, loved reading the Greek and Roman classics Homer, Plato. While forced to publicly maintain a pretense of Christian faith, he secretly rejected it, studying philosophy, particularly Neoplatonism, and inducting himself into pagan mystery cults at the famous school of Athens.
So his cousin, Constantius II, who had eventually secured the throne, looked at this awkward student, a bookworm, and was desperate for military help against the barbarians in Gaul.
Right. So he reluctantly summoned Julian and sent him west with just 360 men who knew only how to pray. It sounds like an insult of a command.
It was intended to be a token gesture.
But Julian surprised everyone. He transformed. The intellectual became an incredibly skilled general and an astute administrator, beloved by his soldiers. His success terrified Constantius II, who tried to strip him of his men and money for a Persian campaign. Julian rebelled, and Constantius II died shortly thereafter, leaving Julian unopposed.
The philosopher king now had the ultimate power, and he immediately dropped the pretense of faith and declared his intention to restore paganism across the empire.
What's fascinating is his method. He was too smart to launch a direct persecution, which had failed Diocletian. Instead, he published an edict of toleration, inviting all exiled Christian bishops, regardless of their faction, back to their sees.
He was hoping the internal theological feuds would destroy the faith for him.
Precisely. He correctly saw that Christianity was already fractured by arguments over the nature of Christ, pitting the Orthodox Nicene position against the Arian factions. He thought that if he allowed them to fight amongst themselves, the whole edifice would collapse, leaving room for the classical gods to return.
But his personal zeal may have been his undoing.
He was extreme. He spent vast sums reopening temples and conducted so many animal sacrifices that his own subjects, who were used to a more physically conservative approach, nicknamed him the Butcher.
The Butcher.
Yeah. The campaign failed. He died fighting the Persians in 363 AD. And our sources note the profound irony that his body was brought back and buried in Tarsus, the very birthplace of St. Paul.
So Julian failed to turn the tide, but his story highlights a huge cultural difference between the new Eastern Empire and the collapsing West.
Julian's failure made it clear that Christianity was the permanent faith of the empire. But crucially, Byzantine scholars, unlike their counterparts in the West, recognized the profound value of pagan philosophy and science. They had just had a philosopher-emperor, and they realized that classical writings contained critical insights.
So while the West is experiencing a period of intellectual retrenchment, with some viewing classical literature as potentially corrupting, Constantinople embraced it.
They absolutely did. They preserved and cultivated this vast pagan literature and scientific text throughout their history. While the West was collapsing and, as the outline describes, shattering civilization, Constantinople was conscientiously protecting and copying the classical past. They were ensuring that when the West was finally ready for Plato again, the texts would be there.
This cultural divergence set the stage for the final political and cultural fracture. In 382 AD, the Emperor Theodosius allowed 200,000 Goths to settle within the imperial borders in Thrace.
And this was the same year that Theodosius was baptized, beginning the final, permanent triumph of Christianity.
Wow.
Which leads us to the historical earthquake of the early 5th century, 410 AD, the sack of Rome.
This was unthinkable. For the first time in 800 years, an invading army Alaric and the Visigoths entered the Eternal City. This didn't just hurt Rome physically, it destroyed Rome philosophically.
The shock was catastrophic. We have the accounts of the time. St. Jerome, writing from Bethlehem, described the horror. A dreadful rumor has come from the West. The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken. This event irrevocably shattered the Western view of the empire as a divinely ordered, inviolate state.
A concept that had endured for a millennium.
Right. Rome, the immortal city, was revealed as mortal, and the philosophical consequence of this was immediate cultural divergence. It created a profound divide. In the West, this catastrophe led Christian thinkers to view their lives as pilgrims, in a temporary, mortal world, diverting their faith away from the state and toward the hereafter. Meanwhile, the East, safe behind the formidable, newly constructed Theodosian walls in Constantinople, weathered the storm and eventually recovered its faith in the empire's universal and divine claims.
So the city on the Bosporus was now viewed as the new, true center of God's grace.
That was the perception.
And the end game for the West was swift and almost anticlimactic. We see the final withdrawal of imperial authority.
Emperor Honorius abandoned Britain, telling the anxious provincial leaders to look after your own fates. The final charade ended in 476 AD. The barbarian general Odoacer decided he was tired of dealing with puppet emperors. He simply exiled the teenage emperor, Romulus Augustulus, a name that ironically invoked both the founder of Rome and the first emperor, and laid down the crown and scepter.
But this is where the genius of the East's diplomacy and survival mechanism shines through, tying back to Diocletian's original vision of two halves.
Exactly. The Latin-speaking Emperor Zeno still sat on the throne in Constantinople. Odoacer, surprisingly, didn't claim the imperial title himself. He sent the Western imperial regalia, the crown, the robes, the scepter to Zeno, asking permission to rule Italy in his name.
What did Zeno do?
He prudently dodged the issue of legitimizing the strongman, but he was faced with another immediate problem. The rampaging Ostrogoths, led by their powerful king, Theodoric, were plundering the Balkans.
So he turned one problem into the solution for the other.
A brilliant diplomatic move. Zeno essentially sent Theodoric to Italy, telling him to deal with Odoacer and rule the land in Zeno's name. It was a perfect two-part solution. He rid himself of the troublesome Ostrogoths in the Balkans and, in theory, maintained the fiction of imperial authority over Italy. The empire hadn't really fallen, you see. It had merely consolidated its political center in the strategic, wealthy East.
As the 6th century began, the East was stable, wealthy, and secure. This brought forth a new giant, Justinian. Adopted by his uncle Justin, he inherited a robust financial position and was determined to pursue an aggressive foreign policy. He believed the time had come to execute the ultimate goal, the reconquest of the collapsed West.
His ambition was absolute, driven by a religious conviction that the Roman Empire must be whole again. He saw the chaotic barbarian kingdoms in the West, where Vandals were tearing down city walls to prevent revolts, and Goths were ruling as an Arian minority, as ripe for liberation.
And he needed to prepare the ground first, which meant religious diplomacy.
He absolutely did. He repaired relations with the papacy, which was strained by theological arguments, knowing this would give him a spiritual wedge. The Arian Gothic ruler Theodoric in Italy was governing a predominantly Nicene Christian population.
Right.
Justinian recognized that if he unified the spiritual authority with Constantinople, he could use that common cause to launch a military intervention, presenting himself not as a conqueror, but as a liberator.
But before the reconquest could even properly begin, Justinian faced a domestic crisis so terrifying that it nearly ended his reign and consumed his capital. The Nika riots of 532 AD.
Right, the famous Hippodrome factions, the Blues and the Greens. They were more than just sports fans. They were organized political and social clubs. Tensions were high due to Justinian's relentless high taxation and restrictive social policies.
And what was the spark?
2 members of rival factions were sentenced to death for murder, and a strange thing happened. The 2 groups briefly united. A single taunt against the emperor in the stadium led to an explosion of coordinated, citywide rage.
30,000 throats simultaneously screamed Nika,
which translates to conquer. But they were screaming it against the emperor. The situation was compounded by the aristocracy, who saw their chance to depose Justinian, joining the looters and demanding his abdication.
Half the city was set ablaze, including the original Hagia Sophia. Justinian and his advisors, faced with a collapsing capital and mounting pressure from the nobility, were ready to flee.
They were discussing escape plans until Empress Theodora, a former actress who understood the stakes of public performance and absolute power, stepped in. She delivered the declaration that changed history. She said, "The royal purple makes the best shroud."
Meaning it was better to die an emperor than to live as an exile.
Exactly. That statement was the turning point. It solidified Justinian's resolve and prompted immediate action. Generals Belisarius and the eunuch Narses were given the order. Using loyal Scandinavian mercenaries, they trapped the mass rioters inside the Hippodrome and slaughtered them mercilessly.
How many?
30,000 people were killed in a single day. Justinian was ruthless in the aftermath, executing 19 senators who had supported the revolt and tearing down their palaces. The Hippodrome remained closed for years, a silent lesson to a chastened capital.
Justinian, with the center of his city in ashes, saw the destruction not as a disaster, but as a divine opportunity to rebuild the city as a glittering center of civilization, culminating in the magnificent Hagia Sophia.
He was determined to build a structure that would visually embody the empire's renewed power and divine mandate. He rejected the traditional classical basilica form. His architects, Anthemius and Isidore, dared to attempt the impossible, building the largest unsupported dome in the world on a square floor plan.
A feat of engineering unheard of at the time.
Right. They achieved this through a system of cascading half-domes and complex weight distribution, creating a sense of lightness that defied the sheer scale of the building. And the speed of construction is breathtaking.
How long did it take?
Using over 10,000 men, organized into two competing teams to maximize efficiency, they completed the massive structure in just over 5 years.
5 years! Incredible!
The materials themselves speak to the global reach of the empire. Gold from Egypt, porphyry from Ephesus, columns hauled from the Temple of the Sun in Rome. When Justinian first entered the finished cathedral, he reportedly cried, "Solomon, I have surpassed thee."
With domestic peace violently secured and the city renewed, Justinian launched his dream, the Reconquest.
General Belisarius was unstoppable initially. He secured Africa from the Vandals quickly and was granted a triumph, the first time a general outside the imperial family had received that honor since 19 BC. It was a massive public declaration that the glorious ancient empire was back.
And then he moved on to Italy,
where he was welcomed as a liberator in Rome in 536 AD. But the campaign was ultimately crippled, first by the internal politics of the court, and then by a disaster beyond human control.
The classic Byzantine paranoia.
Yes, Justinian feared the power and popularity of his brilliant general. He deliberately undercut Belisarius' authority by dispatching the eunuch Narses with a separate command to watch him. The ensuing confusion and lack of coordinated strategy led directly to the loss of Milan.
However, the true catastrophe was the plague of Justinian in 541 AD.
This was the first recorded pandemic of bubonic plague, and it hit Constantinople savagely. The disease raged unchecked for 4 months. At its height, the casualty rate was an unimaginable 10,000 per day.
10,000 a day.
Corpses overwhelmed the graveyards. They had to be stacked in towers or loaded onto ships and pushed out to sea. Trade ceased, and farmers abandoned their fields. The impact was devastating not just demographically, but fiscally and militarily.
A huge loss of taxpayers and soldiers.
Conservative estimates suggest perhaps a fourth of all people around the Mediterranean died. The empire lost a critical portion of its resources. The reconquest in Italy sputtered and collapsed, and Justinian, still fearful of any single powerful commander, split his already diminished military command among no fewer than 5 squabbling generals, ensuring military weakness and guaranteeing that the reconquest, though partial, could not be held long-term.
Following Justinian, the empire staggered. The emperors who followed often traded necessary, difficult policies for temporary popularity, leaving the state weak and vulnerable to the threats that would define the 7th century.
And the crisis was existential. The sources detail the near collapse under Heraclius, who only seized the throne by sailing the African fleet to Constantinople. He faced immediate disaster. The Persian king Chosroes II overran Mesopotamia and Armenia.
The empire shrank drastically.
In 614 AD, Jerusalem fell, and the ultimate Christian relic, the true cross, was captured. The final blow came in 619 AD when Egypt was sacked, ending the crucial free bread and grain supply for Constantinople after 6 centuries. The end seemed inevitable.
So how did Heraclius manage to turn this around? This is truly a story of miraculous survival.
It was a combination of shrewd political maneuvering and religious fervor. Heraclius managed to rally the traumatized population by agreeing to remain in Constantinople only if they swore to accept whatever financial sacrifice he demanded.
And he turned to the church.
He did. The patriarch Sergius pledged the church's entire immense wealth, all its gold and silver plate, to solve the empire's financial woes, creating the first great state-church alliance for survival. With that wealth, he rebuilt and trained his army, and though it took a decade, he shattered the Persians and triumphantly restored the true cross.
But the exhausting war left both empires, the Persian and the Byzantine, utterly vulnerable to a new, infinitely more predatory enemy.
The Arab tide. Erupting seemingly from nowhere in Arabia, they conquered territories that had been Hellenized for a millennium in a matter of decades. The empire lost Syria, Palestine, and eventually North Africa, the birthplace of its savior, Heraclius.
What saved Constantinople from the same fate as Jerusalem?
Technology and geography. Constantinople was saved by its near impregnable walls and the invention of a critical naval weapon, Greek fire. This was invented by Callinicus of Heliopolis, a Syrian refugee who brought the secret formula to the capital.
And what made this substance so revolutionary and terrifying?
Its composition remains a state secret to this day. We only know its effects. It was a devastating liquid that could be projected from siphons onto enemy ships. Crucially, water only spread the flames. It couldn't extinguish them. It was used to annihilate the Arab fleet attempting to siege the city in 674 AD.
Giving Constantinople the naval superiority needed to survive the crisis.
Exactly. Even after survival, though, the empire was psychologically traumatized, having lost two-thirds of its territory. This led to a profound religious crisis. Citizens asked, why had God withdrawn his protection from the New Rome?
Which led directly to the iconoclastic controversy.
Right. Emperor Leo III, surveying the wreckage of the empire, provided the answer. The culprit was sacred icons. He argued that the widespread veneration of images had blurred the line into idolatry, a direct violation of the Second Commandment, and God was punishing the empire for it.
The controversy was not merely theological, it was instantly political and violent.
Explosive. Leo III ordered the destruction of the prominent, centuries-old golden icon of Christ that sat above the Great Palace Gate, sparking widespread riots in the capital. The iconoclasts, the icon smashers, faced massive resistance, particularly from the monasteries and the common people.
This is not a quick debate. It spanned decades.
Constantine V solidified the policy, packing church councils with his supporters to condemn the use of icons as heretical. But the political damage to this zealotry was immense, particularly in the West. This harsh persecution cut off much of Asia Minor from the larger Christian community, breeding resentment and allowing the West to fundamentally question the imperial claims to universal authority.
And this theological split gave the Pope in Rome the opportunity he needed to assert autonomy, driving the final wedge between the eastern and western halves of the old Roman world.
Absolutely. The ideological fracture completed in 800 AD with the coronation of Charlemagne, king of the Franks, as Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope. In Constantinople's eyes, this was an unthinkable usurpation. It asserted a new, rival Western imperial power, one backed by the Church of Rome.
Meanwhile, the empire itself was visibly declining during this period of turmoil.
Internal structures were failing. Our sources note that cities dwindled. Athens became a mere provincial town. Civic planning, once the glory of Rome, vanished. Even Constantinople's massive aqueduct was allowed to remain in disrepair for over a century. Society became heavily militarized, with the army overthrowing 8 emperors in the 7th and 8th centuries alone.
It's clear that the empire managed to cling on, but how did it move from this state of collapse and internal chaos back to being a functional, powerful state?
The key was that iconoclasm never truly commanded popular support. It was primarily an imperial mandate. In 843 AD, Empress Theodora, acting as regent for her son, officially ended the controversy and restored the icons. This moment, commemorated today as the Sunday of Orthodoxy, allowed art and religious devotion to flourish again, signaling a return to traditional stability.
And stability returned in the form of Basil-Deza, the founder of the Macedonian dynasty, a family line that would successfully rule for nearly 2 centuries.
Basil, I was uneducated, self-made man, but he was an extremely effective, strong steward of the state. He recognized that for the empire to reclaim its Mediterranean destiny, it needed naval power. He poured money into rebuilding the derelict fleet, which became the tip of the spear for a grand offensive against the Arabs.
He's aggressive.
Very. He reconquered Cyprus and cleared Muslims out of Dalmatia. And the sources have a fantastic anecdote that illustrates the audacity of this newly rebuilt navy. In one instance, Admiral Nicetas Orifice was chasing Cretan pirates. Instead of sailing the massive fleet all the way around the Peloponnese Peninsula, he decided to save time by dragging his entire fleet of war vessels across the 4-mile width of the Isthmus of Corinth.
He dragged them across land.
Dropped them into the Gulf of Corinth to surprise the pirates. That's the kind of determination and ingenuity that marked this resurgence.
Basil's son, Leo VI, or the Wise, was a different kind of emperor, a brilliant scholar who focused on intellectual and legal revival.
He was a true intellectual contrast to his rugged father. Leo's great achievement was codifying Roman law into Greek, creating the Basilica, a massive 6-volume update of Justinian's system. This standardization of law provided a crucial foundation for the administration and lasted for centuries.
Domestically brilliant, but less successful in foreign policy.
His arrogance led to a major blunder. He foolishly raised import taxes on Bulgarian goods, provoking Tsar Simeon into a massive retaliatory war that led to a humiliating Byzantine defeat. His personal life was also turbulent. Desperate for a legitimate male heir, he married 4 times, which was canonically illegal. He had a son, Constantine VII, born in the Porphyra, the Purple Room.
Thus coining the term porphyrogenitus, the purple-born, to establish his legitimacy.
And to legitimize his controversial 4th marriage, he had to appeal all the way to Rome. He did, accepting the Pope's ruling, which the Pope happily provided, as it was a prime opportunity to assert papal supremacy over the Eastern Emperor, a sign of the growing fissure.
This period then transitioned into an era of immense military resurgence under the warrior emperors, brilliant generals who temporarily usurped the legitimate Macedonian heirs.
Men like Nicephorus II, Phocas, known as the Pale Death of the Saracens, due to his severity and ascetic nature. He was a military engine. He recovered Crete after 135 years of Arab control and recovered Antioch, humbling the powerful emirate of Aleppo into a vassal state.
But the sources suggest his abrasive personality was almost as damaging as his military prowess was successful.
His total lack of tact alienated Christian neighbors. He was notoriously severe. He reportedly insulted German ambassadors and had Bulgarian ambassadors slapped in the face for daring to ask for money. His arrogance laid the groundwork for future conflicts.
His end was typical of the political chaos of the time.
He was assassinated by his own nephew, John of Zimisces, who was charming, brilliant, and utterly ruthless. John executed Nicephorus and was then crowned. He continued the offensive, annexing Bulgaria and raiding deeply into Palestine, coming tantalizingly close to retaking Jerusalem.
But he decided against it.
Judged that weakening the Fatimids was more important than holding the city, leaving the dream of retaking Jerusalem to wait in vain for more than a century.
And then the legitimate heir, Basil II, finally secured the throne, emerging from years as a pawn in court intrigue to become one of Byzantium's most formidable figures.
Basil II had to prove his right to rule by strength, fighting a brutal 3-year civil war against 2 formidable rivals. He lost his first major campaign against Tsar Samuel of Bulgaria, and that failure taught him a bitter lesson. Relentless, year-round commitment was required. He was a general who lived in the field, wearing soldiers' clothes, prioritizing action over palace luxury.
He demonstrated this strength in an extraordinary show of logistical power.
Absolutely. When the Fatimids besieged Antioch, threatening all of northern Syria, Basil II mounted a massive relief effort. He mobilized an army of 80,000 men and 80,000 mules, loaded with supplies, and made the 3-month journey from Constantinople to Syria in an unbelievable 16 days.
16 days.
Possible thanks to the carefully maintained Diocletian-era roads. The speed and sheer scale of his arrival terrified the Fatimid army into immediate flight. He was equally relentless in the Balkans,
where he earned his famous moniker.
He ended the 4th-century struggle for the Balkans, decisively crushing the Bulgarians in 1014. It was a crushing Byzantine victory that earned him the nickname the Bulgar Slayer. By the time of his death, the empire had doubled in size, becoming the strongest, wealthiest power in the Mediterranean.
A true superpower state. So, if he was so successful, what was the structural failure that led to the eventual collapse?
His ultimate failure was succession planning. Basil II left no direct worthy heir. The arrogant, insulated court, composed of powerful officials and bureaucrats, deliberately chose weak, pliable emperors who were more interested in palace intrigue than governing effectively.
And they made a fatal structural decision almost immediately after Basil II's death.
They abandoned the Macedonian land laws, which had protected the system of peasant soldiers. This policy led to the collapse of the vital citizen army system, forcing a reliance on expensive, often treacherous foreign mercenaries. Within 50 years, this internal rot brought the entire powerful empire to its knees.
The internal rot created vulnerability, and the first major blow was purely religious, falling in 1054, the Great Schism.
This was the culmination of centuries of cultural drift and theological hair-splitting that we've seen building since the Iconoclast controversy. The 4 Eastern patriarchs preferred decision by council consensus based on apostolic tradition, but the Pope, the only remaining patriarch in the West, was increasingly asserting papal supremacy.
The idea that he had the final, unilateral authority over the entire Christian world.
Right. And at its root, the conflict was about power. Rome asserting control and Constantinople rejecting it. The crisis became inevitable. It culminated in mutual excommunication between the Pope's legate and the patriarch Michael Cerularius.
This wasn't just a theological argument, it was a political earthquake.
And the consequence was catastrophic for Byzantium. They were now dangerously and terrifyingly alone, facing a rapidly changing world without the possibility of succor from the West.
The second blow came swiftly in 1071.
The neglect of the professional army, replaced by mercenaries, led directly to the decisive disaster at Manzikert against the Seljuk Turks. Though the actual loss of men wasn't critical, the political fallout was terminal. Turks poured into Asia Minor Anatolia, robbing the empire of its most critical source of stable manpower, grain, and tax revenue. The empire was now fighting over its corpse.
It was in this state of existential despair that Emperor Alexius the Protecunenus requested aid from the West against the Turks. This desperate plea inadvertently gave rise to the Crusades, a solution that proved to be a threat in disguise.
Alexius was terrified by what arrived. The massive Crusader armies, composed of Western knights, easily doubled the size of his own forces. He rightly suspected that if they were allowed to unite, they would attack Constantinople, not Jerusalem. He forced every major leader to swear an oath of allegiance to him.
But the relationship was immediately characterized by deep mutual mistrust.
The Byzantines, educated and sophisticated, viewed the Western knights as uneducated, swaggering, violent barbarians. The Crusaders, meanwhile, saw Alexius as a grasping, duplicitous ruler who refused to engage in a proper holy war. They ignored their oaths almost immediately.
The inevitable climax of this mistrust came in 1204 AD with the ultimate betrayal, one of the darkest moments in Christian history, the Fourth Crusade.
The diversion was masterminded by Venice, and specifically the blind Doge Enrico Dandolo, who was seeking financial gain and vengeance. He played on the Crusaders' need for transport and lack of funds, redirecting them from the Levant to Constantinople itself.
The ensuing sack was atrocious. It went far beyond mere looting. It was an act of pure cultural destruction and religious desecration.
The looting was terrible. Ancient Greek statues that had survived a millennium were toppled and melted down for coinage. Churches were desecrated, and the great Hagia Sophia, the jewel of Christendom, was defiled.
The sources recount specific horrors.
A common prostitute was mockingly seated upon the patriarchal throne, and the massive stone altars were tipped over and used as feed troughs for the Crusaders' horses. This event created an irreconcilable chasm between East and West. It was a final, unforgivable act.
The Byzantines concluded that the men with the cross sewn brightly on their armor were not merely heretics, but something worse.
They openly stated that they would rather be ruled by an infidel Muslim than by these murderous, culturally ignorant Latin Christians. The sack crippled the empire financially and militarily, condemning its remnants to what one historian grimly called 5 centuries of a living death under the heel of the Turks.
Though Michael VIII eventually recaptured Constantinople in 1261, the empire was a fractured shadow, unable to recover its strength.
The relentless Ottoman Turks moved in to finish the job. They took advantage of a massive earthquake in Gallipoli in 1354, which breached the ancient walls of the city. They claimed it was a sign from God, gained their first European toehold, and refused to leave.
The end came quickly after that. Adrianople fell in 1362, completely surrounding the capital, reducing the once massive empire to an insignificant speck.
A walled city-state clinging to the Bosporus. The last emperor, Constantine the Great, was desperate. He remained uncrowned due to religious controversy. His final gamble for Western aid was reading the Decree of Union, formally joining the Orthodox and Catholic churches in the Hagia Sophia. But the promised Western aid never truly materialized.
Beyond a few hundred men.
The final siege of 1453 was inevitable. 7,000 desperate defenders, including the Genoese expert Justiniani, faced 80,000 seasoned Ottoman troops led by Sultan Mehmed II. The Sultan's massive guns battered the walls near the Lycus River Valley. When Justiniani was gravely wounded and retreated from the breach, panic set in among the remaining forces.
Constantine the final emperor, knew all was lost. In an act of true nobility and defiance, he flung off his imperial regalia, crying, "The city is lost, but I live," and disappeared into the breach, dying fighting alongside his men.
His body was never positively identified. The service taking place inside the Hagia Sophia was famously interrupted. Priests were killed, or, as legend claims, miraculously melted into the southern wall of the sanctuary, waiting for the day they can emerge and resume the liturgy of the fallen city. After 11,123 years and 18 days, the Byzantine Empire, the inheritor of Rome, was ended. So, after this millennium-long struggle, from the desperate reforms of Diocletian to the final stand of Constantinople, what does this forgotten civilization leave us? We return to the paradox. An empire consigned to obscurity, but whose influence absolutely defined the course of the modern world. The sources reveal Byzantium's greatest gift to the West was not gold or military aid, but its exiled intellectuals. Following the sack of 1204 and the final fall in 1453, scholars streamed into Western Europe, bringing with them the lost classics of Greek and Roman civilization that they had diligently preserved in Constantinople's libraries.
This influx of texts, the full works of Plato, Demosthenes, the complete Iliad, electrified a West that was just starting to feel the first blush of humanism. It provided the deep well of knowledge and curiosity that sparked the Renaissance.
The very rebirth of European learning. Without those Byzantine refugees and their intellectual baggage, the Renaissance as we know it might never have happened or would have been drastically delayed.
And the Eastern legacy lived on as well.
Exiles fled to the last great free Orthodox state, Russia. They adopted the Byzantine court ceremonial, the double-headed eagle as their symbol, and the title of Tsar, their version of Caesar, believing themselves to be the third Rome, continuing the Byzantine dream of a universal Christian empire.
So we've tracked the entire history, recognizing the massive debt we owe. Here is the final provocative thought we leave you with. The tragedy is not only how the empire fell, but that its voice has been consistently ignored by Western history.
The mutual contempt, driven by the schism and the Crusades, led the West to dismiss over 1,000 years of political lessons. This was a civilization that successfully managed to balance church and state, faith and reason, and maintain centralized political stability across inherently volatile lands for an incredible length of time. The greater tragedy is that the critical historical lessons afforded by Byzantine history lessons in survival, diplomacy, and the costs of internal political rot remain unlearned simply because of old cultural prejudice and historical resentment.
1,000 years of continuous, sophisticated history hidden behind a veil of Western bias. That's one debt we, as informed citizens, should probably work on repaying. Thank you for joining us for the deep dive.